When the president of my HOA ruined my beloved creek. Because it lowered property values, I discovered a completely lawful means to prevent his whole street from being blocked by 5 semi-trucks. How far would this power-hungry man go when he found out he'd crossed the wrong homeowner? The rumble of heavy equipment woke me up. I ran to my window and my eyes wouldn't believe it. Workers in yellow vests digging up my creek. I grabbed on clothes and ran outside, heart racing against my ribs. "Stop, what are you doing?" I yelled. Waving my arms wildly, the foreman looked at his clipboard. HOA orders. This waterway is being covered and redirected. I stood there in shock, watching his excavators tore through the delicate ecosystem where my kids had spent countless summer afternoons catching tadpoles and building tiny leaf boats. That creek had been the reason I bought this house in Pine Haven Meadows 10 years ago. There must be some mistake, I insisted. Nobody told me about this. The foreman shrugged. Take it up with Mr. Reynolds. We're just doing what we get paid for. James Reynolds, of course, the newly appointed HOA president, who moved in 6 months ago and promptly began complaining about everything: my garden gnomes, the color of my mailbox, even the bird feeders I hung in my oak tree. Now he was ruining my creek. I marched straight to his oversized colonial home with its picture-perfect grass and rang doorbell reap time, and again, as he finally opened his face, remained no surprised. "Ah, I see that you've taken notice of our neighborhood improvement plan," he said with a self-righteous grin. "Improvement? You're erasing a natural habitat. Why wasn't I informed?" My voice trembled in rage. Reynolds tightened his golf shirt. "The announcement was in last month's HOA newsletter page, for I suppose the board voted unanimously that the uncontrolled waterway makes an unkempt look that devalues neighboring properties. That's absurd. That creek has been there longer than this neighborhood anyway. RCC and RS explicitly state that the HOA retains control over all outside appearances. The rocks and landscaping will look much more controlled." He stressed the last word like it was something valuable. I spent most of the day making desperate calls to the other board members, to the county environmental office. Even a lawyer friend, nobody could assist immediately by sunset. My lovely creek had been diverted partially by unsightly concrete channels and covered with decorative stone, where it ran behind Reynolds and his friends' houses. On the board that evening, I lay awake. I was thinking about the innumerable occasions my daughter Emma had squealed with excitement discovering a rainbow-colored crawfish, or how my son Tyler had mastered skipping stones on the wider warps. The creek wasn't merely water, it was our family's memories. The following morning, I went to the county records office as soon as it opened. I had to see the property lines, the HOA's real authority. Anything that would assist me in fighting back the clerk. An older woman named Doris appeared sympathetic to my plight. "HOAs believe they're mini-kingdoms," she grumbled, assisting me in gaining access to computerized maps of our subdivision. "But they don't always have the complete picture." 4 hours I studied property records, plat maps, and the original development plans for Pine Haven Meadows. Most of it validated what Reynolds had told me. The HOA did have sweeping control of the outside appearances, and then I stumbled upon something revealing in the emergency access easements. "Doris, what does that notation signify?" I indicated a line on the map. She readjusted her glasses. "That's intriguing. In accordance with this, the emergency access road, which lies behind the eastern lots, wasn't totally dedicated to the Temptown ship. Some of it belongs to the adjacent lot owners." My pulse racing. "So the road that runs behind my house is partially yours," she asserted. "It's an easement, so you can't obstruct emergency traffic, but otherwise it's yours to the center line." I thanked her extremely gratefully and departed with copies of everything. As I headed home, an idea started brewing. That emergency access road was hardly ever used for its stated purpose. But Reynolds and his board allies all resided on that street and employed it as their main entrance, a private cut-through, which saved them from circling the main neighborhood loop at home. I phoned my cousin Derek, who operated a small trucking company. "Hey, how bad do you need garage space for your semis this week?" I inquired. "Why? What are you going to do?" He sounded shady but interested. "A lesson in property rights," I said. "How many trucks can you spare for a few days?" Derek laughed. "For you after that time. You helped me move on Christmas Eve. I've got 5 rigs between hauls right now." Perfect. We made arrangements for early the next morning, and I spent the evening carefully measuring my property line along emergency access road line, marking precisely where I could park legally. Vehicles without obstructing actual. At the entrance to the neighborhood, they trailed me to the access road where I instructed them to park 5 enormous semi-trucks in a staggered line. Each truck was legally parked on my side of the easement, leaving only enough space for one car to slowly make its way through technically accessible to emergency vehicles, but a real headache for normal traffic. I was brewing coffee when my phone rang. Reynolds' name flashed on the screen. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" he yelled. "Not waiting for me to say hello, exercising my property rights." I responded calmly, as per county records. "I own part of that access road. I'm simply letting my cousin park his commercial vehicles on my property. This is plainly retaliation. I can't even get my car out without scratching it. Sorry to hear that. Maybe you could use the front neighbor entrance just like everyone else." I think the notice regarding this parking arrangement was on page 4 of my own newsletter. Did you not get it? The quiet which followed was richly rewarding. "This is not finished," he finally spoke, his voice icy. "The board will act. I'm looking forward to debating it," I said before hanging up. Less than an hour later, my doorbell was ringing incessantly as irate neighbors insisted that I relocate the trucks. I explained the circumstances politely to each of them, producing the property records and reminding them that I had received no forewarning before my creek was devastated. Some hurled off, but some actually heard me, especially when I told them the creek was legally protected under county watershed regulations. By noon hours, Reynolds had summoned an emergency HOA meeting for that evening. Phase 1 of my plan was going great. Now I had to get ready for Phase 2. What would take place when I entered that meeting room and confronted the whole angry board? Would my property records suffice? Or had I just initiated a neighborhood war that I couldn't win? The community center hummed with irate voices as I entered for the emergency HOA meeting. Reynolds had clearly rallied his supporters. Nearly 50 residents packed the room, many shooting daggers at me with their eyes. I clutched my folder of documents tightly, suddenly questioning if I'd gone too far. "There he is," someone shouted, the man blocking our road. Reynolds stood at the front, his face mask of righteous indignation. The gavel banged loudly, calling for order. This emergency session would come to order. Reynolds declared, "We here to resolve a grave transgression of community standards and good faith neighbor behavior." I sat in the back row, attempting to ignore the whispers that surrounded me. Reynolds began with a melodramatic speech about how my nefarious and petty act of revenge was putting the community at risk by potentially blocking emergency traffic, when he eventually took a breath. I raised my hand. "Can I reply to these accusations?" "You'll have your turn," he barked first. "I'd like to hear from other residents who were impacted for 20 agonizing minutes. I heard my neighbors moaning about being inconvenienced." Elaine Walker, Reynolds' greatest defender on the board, explained how she almost scraped her Mercedes maneuvering between two lorries. Thomas Quinn, a new board member and recent developer, warned of plummeting property values if such vigilante-like behavior is allowed to exist at last. Reynolds turned to me with a smile. "Now would you like to say your piece before we have a vote on the suitable punishment?" I stood and walked to the front with all eyes in the room, seemingly on me. I opened my folder and laid my documents on my table 3 days ago, with no notice to me. The HOA killed a natural waterway on my property that's been there for generations. My kids grew up playing in that creek. It was a haven for local animals, and it was destroyed because Mr. Reynolds decided it appeared unkempt. I turned to look at the room. How most of you got real notice that the creek was being eliminated. A real notice, not a hidden mention in a newsletter. Nobody reads. A few people squirmed uncomfortably. No hands went up. I went to the county records office and found something interesting. I kept sliding the property maps across the table. The emergency access road that runs behind our houses isn't completely HOA property. Each homeowner owns the space behind their lot to the center line. I'm merely exercising my property rights in permitting cars to park there. Just as the HOA exercised its felt rights on my creek. Reynolds, my face darkened. "This is obviously retaliatory." And also, I interrupted producing another paper I called the County Environmental Office that creek lies within a protected watershed. Its diversion without permits is in fact illegal. A whisper went through the crowd. This was news to most of them. That's ridiculous, Reynolds stuttered. The board went over all regulations required from the center of the room. A man stood up. I knew Trevor Mitchell, a retired environmental engineer who was reclusive. I'd hardly spoken with him in the 5 years he'd resided. In fact, Trevor wasn't the board made aware of this study. I wrote a detailed letter when you suggested beautification 6 months ago. Trevor responded. It was waved aside without discussion. The atmosphere in the room was changing. I could sense it. People were looking at one another, at Reynolds, at me. Elaine Walker recovered. First, this doesn't alter the fact that those trucks are a danger and an eyesore. We need to vote to get them taken away right away and locate this troublemaker before you vote, I said calmly. You know, I've already made a formal complaint with County Environmental Services. They're sending inspectors tomorrow morning. The fines for unauthorized watershed disruption begin at $10,000 per day. A stunned silence descended on the room. Reynolds' face had turned from red to white. Who was going to pay those fines? Someone asked anxiously. The HOA, I said, meaning all of us through special assessments. Unless, of course, we could come to a more reasonable solution. Reynolds regained his voice. This is blackmail, this is negotiation. I fixed up the trucks will be relocated as soon as there is a plan approved to have my creek restored to its natural course, and from here on out, any substantial changes to the individual properties will need directification and approval by the homeowners. In question for a moment, no one spoke, then came Trevor Mitchell. I move that we establish an environmental review committee to create a creek restoration plan, effective immediately. I second called another voice. Mrs. Abernathy, whose grandchildren frequently played along the creek when they visited Reynolds, glanced around desperately, but he was losing control of the room. More residents were nodding, talking amongst themselves. Fine, he finally said through gritted teeth. Weak. Form a committee. But those trucks have to be moved now, not after some lengthy review process. 3 days, I negated the same period of time I had to witness my creek being desecrated. The committee introduces an initial plan in 3 days. The trucks operate, and subsequently we worked cooperatively on a proper execution before Reynolds could oppose. Trevor put motion to vote. The majority shot up their hands in favor of my idea. When the meeting ended, people approached me with bittersweet reactions. Some were encouraging, others still furious but resigned. Trevor gave me his card that required courage. He said softly, I've been itching to take on Reynolds' dictatorial approach for months, but didn't want to upset the boat. I'd be delighted to chair the environmental committee. I felt a sense of relief and exhaustion. I'd won this battle, but Reynolds was not the kind to give up without a fight, as if he could read my mind. He walked in as the room cleared. You think you're smart? He growled, voice low. But you've caught a strong enemy today. I established this town. I have friends in the township, in the county buildings. Your little creek won't be the only thing that's dug under. He walked away before I could say anything. His threat lingered in the air, chilling my victory moment. What had I initiated, and how much would Reynolds go to ensure he controlled Pine Haven Meadows? Reynolds came down hard with his gavel. Such a rush-hour emergency session of Pine Haven Meadows Homeowner Association will be brought into order. My heart pounding as I held on to my folder full of documents. The community hall rang out in the irate tones of angry voices. Most neighbors had never been to an HOA meeting previously, but my semi-trucks had definitely caught their attention. People stood against walls and sat cross-legged on the floor because all 30 chairs were occupied before we start. Reynolds said between clenched teeth, I want to speak about the outrageous circumstance obstructing our emergency access road. 5 commercial vehicles have made it almost impossible for residents to access their homes. Elaine Walker shot to her feet, her designer scarf flying. My daughter was late to her dance recital. We had to walk 4 blocks in the rain because we couldn't get our car out. Her finger poked the air in my direction. This is harassment, plain and simple. Grunts of assent rippled through the crowd. I took a deep breath, remaining seated while surveying the room. Many faces exhibited anger, but others seemed inquisitive. Reynolds gestured at me. You have 1 minute to clarify yourself prior to our taking a vote regarding emergency removal options and valid penalties. I walked steadily to the podium with my folder. Thank you for the chance to address. My voice sounded stronger than I had anticipated. I understand everybody's ire. I felt likewise last week when crews appeared unexpectedly to destroy my creek on my property. That was a board-approved beautification project. Reynolds cut in. Actually, I said, spreading my papers on the table. I've brought copies of my property deed survey maps and the county waterway protection statutes. I distributed stacks to individuals in the front row to pass around the filled-in creek. Isn't only on my property, it's a designated natural W. Environmental Office Reynolds's face turned bright red. That's germane to your trucks blocking. As to the trucks, I kept sliding more papers across the table. They're parked on a part of the access road that, due to township records, part of the falls on my property line, I've marked the sections that apply. They're legally parked and have proper permits. A tall woman in the back whistled. Someone else grumbled. Wow, they really chose the wrong person to screw with. Reynolds, grab the papers. This isn't giving you the right to shut off an emergency access route. Actually came a new voice in the back. Due to Pine Haven bylaws, emergency access needs to be kept at least 12 feet wide. I took a measurement this morning, despite the trucks. There's still 14 feet of room. People looked to see Trevor Mitchell approaching the front. Trevor lived in Pine Haven for 15 years, but only spoke at meetings. Occasionally he was a retired civil engineer who generally kept to himself working on his immaculate garden. I've been tracking the board's decisions for a while. Trevor explained, putting his own fat folder on the table, featuring 7 individual bylaw infractions in just the last year alone. Reynolds' face grew darker. This meeting isn't about previous board decisions, maybe it should be? Trevor responded, opening up his folder. Particularly the illegal realignment of a protected waterway without environmental approvals that has the potential to be criminal penalties under state law. The room erupted. Mrs. Gonzalez from 2 streets over to up my basement flooded last week for the first time in 20 years. Right after that, creek work. My well water turned brown, called someone else. Reynolds banged his gavel repeatedly. Order, this is absurd. Elaine rushed to his defense. James has done nothing but try to keep our property values. That nasty ditch was an eyesore. Trevor produced a big aerial map. Nasty Ditch is part of Willow Creek, which flows into the county reservoir. It's covered under the Clean Water Act. I hadn't known this fact. My research had centered on property lines, not environmental law. I looked at Trevor with new respect. In addition, Trevor ballot all in favor. Sarah questioned, virtually all hands were raised. Why don't we recess for today? Trevor suggested calmly, give everybody time to read through these files, and maybe our president should call the county environmental office personally. Prior to them calling him, Reynolds glared at me with such contempt, I shivered. This meeting is adjourned, he grumbled, grasping his papers in a rush as individuals streamed out. Many paused to look at my documents more intently. Trevor came with a group of homeowners that I did not know. I'm impressed with your work, he said, shaking my hand. I've been working on building a case against Reynolds for months, but had to have something set it off in order to get it forward. Why, I asked, shaking his hand because Trevor dropped his voice. There's more to this than a field in creek, much more. Have you seen the HOA financial records recently? Or noticed which houses had new roofs last year after the hailstorm and which did not? Reynolds isn't bending rules, he's violating laws. I looked at him, realizing this neighborhood struggle had just become a whole lot bigger than my own fight. We need to talk, said one of the women to Trevor. I'm on the county water board. If that creek is what Trevor believes it is, we could be facing some serious environmental infractions. As we exchanged numbers, I caught Reynolds eyeing us from across the room, his cell phone against his ear. His look sent a crawl down my arm. What had I gotten myself into? This had been a disagreement about my tranquil creek, but was becoming something very nasty. How far reached this corruption, and what would be done by Reynolds to suppress it? County Environmental Field Inspector Maria Ramirez pulled her government-issued SUV up behind my driveway at exactly 9 a.m. 2 official vehicles brought it up the road. The neighbor poked through windows as inspectors in uniform blanketed my yard with measuring gear and sample kits. The creek bed is filled with non-permeable material, Maria observed, scratching on the decorative rocks. This is a violation of Section 44 of the Clean Water Act. Did anyone submit environmental impact statements prior to this taking place? Not that I'm aware of, I said. The HOA president had it done. The fines start at $225,000 a day of offense, she said, photography, plus restoration expense. Trevor had come along with maps indicating the creek's route across the neighborhood that is part of the watershed. He told Maria feeds directly into Harmon Reservoir, which makes this a public water supply issue as well. Maria frowned, typing notes onto her tablet. We'll have to test for pollutants right away. Reynolds' Mercedes braked hard at the curb. He walked across my lawn, adjusting his tie. What is the idea here? You have no right to bring government officials onto HOA property without board approval. Maria spun slowly. Mr. Reynolds and Maria Ramirez, County Environment. I'd never actually spoken to had called expressing their support. Environmental activist groups offered up legal aid. The county commissioner's office vowed an investigation on the spot. Margaret Tanner turned up at my doorstep, uninvited, her studied calm utterly gone. What have you done? She spat. Quinn, development is suing all of us. They claim we promised them those permits. You made illegitimate promises you couldn't fulfill, I said calmly. And you hurt my property while you're at it. You don't know what you're playing with. Her voice broke with real fear. These individuals aren't developers only. They have political connections, political influence. Before I was able to reply, a black SUV arrived. Thomas Quinn himself emerged, a tall individual in an upscale suit with a smile that never left his eyes. So this is the troublemaker, he said, looking me up and down. Let's discuss in private how we can fix this situation to the benefit of all. There's nothing to discuss. I responded, seeing some neighbors exiting their houses, observing the altercation. You attempted to ravage a safeguarded watershed for financial gain. Quinn's smile never left his face. I'm willing to provide you with an extremely high compensation plan. New kitchen bathroom makeover, even a pool, whatever you desire. I desire my creek restored, and I desire you to be penalties for trying to harm a preserved watershed. His tone grew tougher. Don't be an idiot. Everybody has a price. Not everybody. Trevor yelled, strolling up my driveway with Sophia David and at least 20 other neighbors, and definitely not this neighborhood. Quinn scanned the gathering audience. His confidence visibly rocked. The recall election is tomorrow, I reminded him, and we've presented all your evidence to the county prosecutor. I'd say your troubles are just starting. That evening, an emergency town hall meeting was convened. Almost every homeowner showed up. Catherine stood before them all and laid it all out. The bribes, the environmental destruction, the back row deals. I was complicit through my silence, she acknowledged. But I can no longer stand by while this corporation intimidates our community, and Watershed. Thomas Quinn came with 3 lawyers attempting to intimidate us into silence. But something amazing occurred instead. One by one, neighbors stood to tell their tales. How their own water features had been targeted, how they'd been bullied by the board, how they missed the natural beauty our community once had. Quinn attempted to speak, but was drowned out by boos. His lawyers whispered quickly in his ear as he looked over the hostel room. Without another word, they filed out through the side door. As the meeting broke up, Margaret came up to me with a few other board members. We want to quit before they recall her, and we testify concerning Quinn's offers if necessary. I gazed into her eyes and saw something I hadn't anticipated. Real regret. Assist us in repairing what we destroyed. I informed her, that's all I ever wanted. Tomorrow's election would determine the future of our community. But tonight, observing neighbors discussing enthusiastically about creek restoration projects, I already felt that we'd gained something valuable. Our community had finally achieved. Together, the question now was whether Quinn Development would take defeat with grace, or if their threatened retribution was yet to come. Voting day came with a hum. I hadn't experienced in our neighborhood in years. People were waiting outside the community center before the doors opened. Some neighbors who never exchanged a word with one another were now intense in discussion about watershed protection and property rights. Never thought I'd find you here, Carol, I said to a rarely seen elderly lady when those trucks arrived. I began to pay attention, she responded with a wink. Nobody messes with our water within the busy room, tension lingered. Reynolds was seated in the corner, arms folded, whispering to his remaining supporters. Trevor stood firm at the podium discussing his vision for an open HOA when he called me up to discuss the creek restoration plan. Reynolds sprang to his feet. "This guy illegally blocked our road. He needs to be arrested. Not elected," he yelled, pointing at me. The room fell silent. I took a deep breath. The creek that was destroyed without proper authorization has been on my property for generations. My grandchildren were to play there just like my children did. What if someone stole something precious of yours? I asked the crowd. Catherine Reynolds, sitting at a distance from her husband, nodded ever so slightly. The ballot began. Folks voted in little booths we'd established. I caught Reynolds eyeing me, his eyes narrow with hatred. For a moment I thought to myself whether this struggle had been worth it. The stress, the threats, the split in our previously peaceful neighborhood. 2 hours later, the results were declared. Trevor would be president. With me as environmental committee chair, Reynolds stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The triumph felt hollow amid so much bitterness. First order of business. Trevor declared filing formal charges against Quinn Development for environmental offenses and restoring the creek. The room burst into applause. That evening, I did not sleep at about 2 a.m. My security system picked up movement in my compound through the window. I saw a dark figure standing close to my garage. I phoned the police, then crept to go and check. It was Reynolds, spray paint, K in hand, writing "traitor" on my garage door. When police came, they discovered more than vandalism equipment in his vehicle. There were copies of all those who had stood up to him with detailed notes regarding their infractions he was going to use against them. News of the arrest of Reynolds spread rapidly. The local newspaper printed the headline, "HOA President. Arrested corruption and vandalism in Pinehaven Meadows." Quinn Development released a statement in denial of any misconduct, but anonymous sources within the company started leaking emails that indicated otherwise. The trucks departed the following day, but not before dropping materials for our creek restoration project. My cousin Derek brought his entire crew to assist on the house. He said this tale is too good not to be included. Neighbors I'd never met arrived with shovels and work gloves. Even Aine Walker Reynolds' old alley stopped by with sandwiches for volunteers. I invested in his dream of ideal property values, she admitted to me as we watched kids lining up river rocks on what would be the creek bed. I never gave a thought to what makes a neighborhood worth something in the first place. Catherine approached me while I took a water break. Her eyes were tired but bright. "I'm getting a divorce," she told her straight. This whole ordeal reminded me how domineering James has been, not only with the neighborhood, but also with me. I had no idea what to reply, so I merely nodded. "I would like to assist with the restoration," she went on. "I once used to teach environmental science prior to James feeling that it wasn't high society enough. Within the course of a few months, the change was extraordinary, not only of the earth, but of the people. Once enemies toiled side by side, the creek started to flow again, cleaner and stronger than it ever had. Wildlife life came back first, insects, then frogs, then later birds that hadn't been seen for years." Reynolds pleaded guilty to vandalism and harassment charges as part of his plea agreement. He was forced to sell his home and relocate away from Pinehaven Meadows. No one was sorry to see the development company Quinn had to face hefty environmental violation fines. Their development plan project was axed after being rejected. County approval, the land they had bought was later donated to a conservation trust, far removed from luxury condos that they intended 6 months after election. We had a grand opening of what we had started to term as Community Creek Park. Children ran along the shores of the restored waterway as parents socialized on new benches. A small display described the watershed's significance and how it fit into the greater river system. Catherine, now going by her maiden name Wilson, cut the ribbon. She'd become the unofficial environmental teacher of the neighborhood, leading creek exploration days for local children. "Scanning all this," she said, sweeping her arm across the healthy green space. "It's difficult to think that James had wanted to bury it under rocks and mulch. Trevor came over with a group of visitors county officials who are interested in our restoration project, as an example for other communities. Your truck stirred up quite a commotion. One commissioner informed me. But sometimes individuals need to have a wake-up call as the celebration went on. I strolled down to a secluded place by the creek. The water burbled over stones, making that soothing noise I'd missed so much. A small cluster of kids were gently catching and letting go, tadpoles under Catherine's supervision. My grandpa tells me you saved the creek. A little boy told me, looking up at me with questioning eyes. We all saved it, I answered. Sometimes you have to fight for what counts that evening. When the party died down, I found myself with Trevor and Catherine sitting on a bench looking out at water. Did you ever dream it would end up like this? Trevor asked. I shook my head. I was simply angry about my creek. I never even considered beginning a movement. That's the way change works, Catherine said gently. One person gets shoved too far and refuses to give in as neighbors bid each other goodnight, going home along trails that bordered our land rather than splitting them. I saw something deep had changed. My little act of defiance with those trucks had cracked open something that had been fermenting for years. Resentment. Yes, but also a longing for real community. The next morning I awoke to the sound of water running and birds singing for the first time in Mo.